Engagement and Inclusion team at NDIA. I'm also joined by my colleagues who are assisting me today. Their names will be posted in the chat. We also have two Auslan interpreters joining us today. Welcome, Naomi and Aaron. We have spotlighted our Auslan interpreters for you. The information session is specifically focused on information for participants, their families, and carers. If you are a provider or a support coordinator, we encourage you to contact the provider team if you have questions. This session is very much participant focused and does not cover or respond to questions relating to providers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country on which we meet today, and their continuing connection to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Our accessibility features today include our Auslan interpreters, Naomi and Aaron, and we have live captions available. The link for this is included in the email that was sent to you prior to this session, and we will post this in the chat. We start the session by keeping microphones and cameras inactive to ensure we have the best possible bandwidth and minimal disruptions for the session today. I'll ask that we keep the use of the chat feature to a minimum during today's presentation, as the use of this can disrupt people who may be using screen readers for accessibility. You may also notice that I do read out the information that is on the slides. This is to ensure that we're making the presentation as accessible to as many people as possible. We will send you an accessible copy of the presentation after the event in a follow-up email. We need to respect everyone's privacy, so we ask you to avoid using information that may identify who you are or the organisation you are describing. During this session, please do not share any personal or protected information, or record or share the information, share the session without consent of all attendees. During this session, only unclassified information such as details published on the NDIA website or general matters not containing personal information may be discussed. At the end of the presentation, we will invite you to place questions about today's topic in the chat feature of Teams. Please do not share any personal information. We need to respect everyone's privacy. And as this is a public forum, we are careful not to respond to any inquiries or questions around individual plans or circumstances which may identify who you are. If you wish to discuss a scenario involving yourself or the person you represent, please contact the NDIA for assistance. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible. And as there are a large number of people joining us today, we will gather the most frequently asked topics to respond to. Now I'll turn to what we're covering in today's presentation. Today's topics we will be discussing include: what do we mean by applying to the NDIS, eligibility for the NDIS, how to apply, and notice of impairments. Before we start, let's all commit to creating a safe and inclusive webinar. Please focus on respectful communication, including in the chat, so everyone feels comfortable sharing and participating. What do we mean by applying to the NDIS? Applying to the NDIS means doing things to find out if you can become a participant and start getting supports under the NDIS. There's a process to follow when you apply to the NDIS. As a part of the process, we will need to confirm your identity. After you apply, we will look at all the information you give us and decide if you're eligible. If we decide you're eligible, you'll become a participant in the NDIS. We will work with you to create a first plan, which will include funding for any reasonable and necessary supports. If you're not eligible, there are other services available to you, such as government and community services. We can help you connect to those other services. Eligibility. There are some requirements you need to be eligible for the NDIS. You need to be younger than 65 when you apply. You must be an Australian citizen or permanent resident and live in Australia, and you'll need to meet the requirements for disability, early intervention, or both. You may be eligible under the disability requirements if you have one or more impairments that are likely to be permanent. This substantially impacts your ability to do daily life activities. Your impairment must also affect your social life or your ability to work, study. You must also likely to need NDIS supports for your lifetime. NDIS supports are the services and items and the equipment that can be funded by the NDIS. You may be eligible under the disability requirements if your disability is caused by an impairment. Your impairments are likely to be permanent and reduces your ability to do daily life activities, such as moving around, communicating, socialising, learning, or your self-care or self-management tasks. Affects your social life, work or study, and you are likely to need the NDIS supports for your whole life. Eligibility. Early intervention requirements. You'll need to meet early intervention requirements if you have an impairment that's likely to be permanent. Early intervention supports will likely benefit you, for example, if it means you need less disability supports in the future and your functional capacity will improve. The early intervention supports you need are NDIS supports. There are different requirements for children younger than 6 with developmental delay. You may also meet the early intervention requirements if you're aged between 0 and 25 with a hearing impairment. How to apply to the NDIS. Applying to the NDIS is how you let us know you want to become an NDIS participant. People aged 9 or older can apply to the NDIS in a few ways. Your local area coordinator can help you apply. They can help you through the application process and be your point of contact. Sometimes you may not have a local area coordinator in your area. For example, if you live remote or very remote areas, you can contact us on 1800 800 110 to discuss further options available to you. For children younger than 9, we encourage families to talk to an early childhood partner before applying to the NDIS. They can offer supports to children before they apply and let families know if the NDIS is right for their child. When you apply, you or your authorised representative will need to give us information and any documents we need to confirm your identity. Give us the information and any documents to decide if you're eligible. Sign or certify the NDIS application. Talk to you about your current needs and current situation. When we talk to you, we'll listen to understand what is important to you. We'll also ask questions to make sure we know all the ways we can help. We can use this information to help you make community connections if you want us to. Other people can help you apply if you want them to. Sometimes they can apply on your behalf. You can learn more about how to apply to the NDIS and applying to the NDIS fact sheet. Evidence. When applying to the NDIS, we will ask you for 2 types of evidence. Evidence of identity. The NDIS asks you for evidence of your identity when you receive community connections or early connections, become a participant, and become a nominee or child representative or authorised representative for a participant. In most cases, we can use your identity documents, for example, one birth or arrival document, and to using community documents such as a bank card, proof of age, Medicare card, or Australian driver's licence. For more information on which documents you can provide to us, see our evidence of identity fact sheets. Evidence of identity is important because we are responsible for keeping your information and privacy safe, and to confirm the supports and funding are going to the right people. We sometimes also need to ask for new evidence if something changes. For example, if you change your name. If you can't do this, let us know so we can work out what to do depending on your situation. We'll still need to check your identity before processing your application. The evidence of disability to allow us to determine whether you meet the disability or early intervention access requirements. You may need to provide evidence of your disability or developmental delay for children younger than 6. What is considered good evidence of disability? Providing good evidence of disability will help us to make decisions about your eligibility for the NDIS. Good evidence is recent, completed by a treating health professional who is relevant to your primary disability, confirms your primary disability, confirms the impacts of your disability on different areas of your life, describes the previous treatments and outcomes, describes future treatment options and expected outcomes of those treatments. The primary disability refers to the impairment that has the greatest impacts most on your daily life. Who can provide the evidence of your disability? You can work with your treating health professionals to provide your evidence of disability. What evidence do I need from my treating professionals? This will depend on your primary disability. If you have not had one of the assessments listed, the types of disability on the types of disability evidence page, your treating health professional will need to provide evidence that you have or are likely to have a permanent disability, including information about the type of disability, the date of your disability was diagnosed, if available, how long the disability will last, and available treatments. Just for example, medications, therapies, or surgeries. Your disability impacts your everyday life in the following areas, including a description of how each area is impacted, mobility or motor skills, communication, social interaction, learning, self-care, and self-management. Who can help you complete an application? Before we accept your application, we make sure it's from you or someone who can apply for you. You can ask someone to help you to apply if you want to. They can help you make decisions to apply to the NDIS and gather the information we need. You can choose who helps you. For example, you could ask help from a family member, a friend, a carer, a partner, a support worker, or service provider, staff in a residential aged care facility, your treating health professional, or hospital staff. How do we decide if you are eligible? Once you submit your application to join the NDIS, we review all the information we have in your application. This will help us decide if you're eligible for the NDIS. As part of the process, we also need to check your identity. We have a diverse workforce. Our staff bring a range of experience and education, including lived experience of disability and formal qualifications in allied health and disability studies. While some staff may not have formal qualifications, all the staff do receive training to apply the access criteria to determine if someone is eligible for the NDIS. If expert advice is needed, our staff have access to a range of experts with allied health and other qualifications. You're eligible for the NDIS if you meet the age, residence, disability or early intervention, or both. If you don't meet either disability requirements or early intervention requirements, you won't be eligible for the NDIS, but an early childhood partner or local area coordinator can help you connect with other government and community supports. What happens after we decide? On the day we decide you're eligible for the NDIS, you become an NDIS participant. The time that you remain eligible for the NDIS depends on your individual circumstances and NDIS support needs. You'll need to continue to be eligible for the NDIS. This means you need to continue to live in Australia and be an Australian citizen or permanent resident. You also need to continue to meet the requirements for disability, early intervention requirements, or both. We will send you a letter to let you know if you are eligible, if you meet the requirements for disability, early intervention, or both, and the next steps. Your letter will also confirm the date you became eligible for the NDIS. If you applied on or after the 1st of January 2025, Your letter will include a notice of impairments, which gives you more information about your eligibility for the NDIS. If you apply before the 1st of January 2025, you won't get a notice of impairments, even if you become eligible for NDIS after the 1st of January 2025. Supports if you're not eligible. If you're not eligible, you can't become an NDIS participant. We'll also send you a letter with our decision, including the reasons you're not eligible and what to do next. Your letter will confirm the date we made the decision. Even if you're not eligible for the NDIS, your early childhood partner or local area coordinator can help you explore and access government and community supports. When we work with the children younger than 9 and their families, we call this early connections. When we work with people aged 9 to 64, we call this community connections. Your early childhood partner or local area coordinator will use the information you shared to suggest supports in your community. They will work with you to see how these supports may help you with what is important to you. We also have a list of other government and community supports that you can get, even if you're not eligible for the NDIS. What if you don't agree with our decisions? If you don't agree with our decisions that you're not eligible, you can contact us. We can help explain our decision and what your options or next steps might be. You can also ask for an internal review. Another staff member who wasn't involved in the original decision will then check if we made the right decision. You need to ask for an internal review within 3 months after receiving the decision. But you can't ask for an internal review if you withdraw your application because you don't want to apply anymore. A decision has not been made and we ask you for more information. We withdraw your application because you didn't give us information on time, or it's been more than 3 months since you received our decision that you're not eligible. Notice of impairments. A notice of impairment. A notice of impairments tells the NDIS participant which categories of impairments were used to meet the access requirements. An impairment is a loss or damage to your body's functions. We will use the 6 impairment categories already in the NDIS Act. Children younger than 6 with a developmental delay. When a child younger than 6 with developmental delays becomes an NDIS participant, the notice of impairment will state that the child has developmental delay. The notice will not include the categories of the impairment. Multiple impairment categories. What if you have 1 or more impairments that meet the NDIS eligibility requirements? A participant may have 1 or more impairments that meet the NDIS access requirements. The notice of impairments will tell the NDIS participant all the categories of the impairment that relate to their eligibility. Notice of impairment examples. Oscar is 25 years old and is eligible for the NDIS under the age, residency, and disability requirements. Oscar has a permanent impairment relating to his spinal cord injury. Oscar recently became a participant of the NDIS. He gets a letter telling him that his NDIS application was successful. He's now a participant. This letter includes a notice of impairments. Oscar's notice of impairments tells him the impairment categories are physical and neurological. Oscar's notice of impairments tells him the categories that related to his permanent impairments. These categories of impairments are physical and neurological. At Oscar's first planning conversation, they discussed the NDIS supports that relate to Oscar's physical and neurological impairments. Oscar understands that he can apply to vary his notice of impairments if it is no longer correct. What does this mean for the participants? A notice of impairment gives a better understanding about how you have accessed the NDIS. It does not change the application of the reasonable and necessary criteria for old framework planning. Supports participants to use their NDIS funding to help with their disability-related needs. What are the categories of the impairments? Intellectual impairments, how you speak and listen, read and write, solve problems, and process and remember information. An intellectual impairment might be noticed at an early age or during the child's early development. Cognitive impairments, how you think, learn new things, use judgments to make decisions, and pay attention. There are some similarities with intellectual impairments, but cognitive impairments might appear at a later stage in life or after a sudden event or injury. Neurological impairments, how your body's nervous system functions. Neurological impairments can happen where there is damage to a person's nervous system, such as their brain or spinal cord, which can affect the way the nervous system processes information. Sensory impairments, how you see and hear. Sensory impairments often relate to hearing or vision loss, but can also include senses. Physical impairments, this means you have reduced ability to move or control parts of your body. Physical impairments might affect your stamina or how quickly your body gets tired. Impairments relating to psychosocial disability, this means you have reduced capacity to perform daily life activities and tasks due to your mental health. The notice of impairment changes. You can apply it to change your notice of impairment. We call this varying notice of impairment. If you think we have made a mistake or you'd like to vary the notice of impairments, you should contact us. You may want to apply to add a category of impairments or to remove an existing category of impairments. To do this, you'll need to give us new evidence. We will look at the new evidence you gave us to decide if we need to add or remove the categories of impairments in your notice. We will send you a letter telling you if we decide to vary or not vary your notice of impairments. Notice of impairment changes. If we change your notice of impairments, you'll need a new notice of impairments, which replaces any previous notices you have been given. It does not impact your existing eligibility for the NDIS. Whether we change your notice of impairments or not, you can talk to us about our decision to vary or not vary your notice of impairments. To do this, you can contact us over the phone or speak to your NDIS contact. Further information and the resources, please refer to our website where you can find information on applying to the NDIS, the booklets and fact sheets, notice of impairments, can I apply to change my notice of impairments, and the frequently asked questions about legislation. Further information, the NDIS has a participant journey booklet available to support people with disability and participants throughout their NDIS journey. To help people with a disability, NDIS participants, carers and their families understand our new computer systems and processes will bring. We have created a participant's journey document. The participant's journey outlines the different steps that people will experience when applying for the NDIS and once they have joined the NDIS. We have also developed new booklets and fact sheets available on the NDIS website and by mail. These fact sheets have been developed as a part of our improvements to our computer system and ways of working. Just appreciate your feedback is very helpful to our team to improve future events. Thank you for taking the time to complete the survey. I'll just leave this up for a couple of minutes. Now, we now invite you to post questions you have about today's topics in the chat. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but there are a large number of people joining us today, so it may not be possible to respond to everyone. We are monitoring the chat and all your comments and questions. and they will be used to inform future communication and updates to the NDIS website. I'll now ask Darren and Tony to join me.
Thanks, Rodney. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being with us here today. My name is Darren. I'm the Senior Community Engagement Officer for New South Wales and ACT, and I'm joined by my colleague Tony Spotswood, who's also Senior Community Engagement Officer. Rodney, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm sure everyone was able to get a lot of information that they needed. We have had to go through a lot today that we are covering. So as Rodney said, please now take the time to enter the questions into the chat. We have Olivia and Emma working through these. And while this is happening, Tony and I will go through some questions. But just before we do that, I would just like to acknowledge that the terms and words that we use really do matter, because the language that we use to refer to people with disabilities has an impact. We use the word impairment as it is the word used in the NDIS Act. So when we say impairment, we mean a loss of or damage to your body's function. So under the law for the NDIS, we check if you're eligible based on your impairments, not your type of disability or diagnosis. So with this presentation, we have received a lot of questions. So we have put some together that we feel that you will really benefit from. So with my colleague Tony that I had just introduced, I might run through some questions here, because no doubt they will answer a lot of the questions that you probably already do have. And if we do have time at the end of this, I can go into the chat and look at some of the questions and answers that the girls have been putting in there. So the first question we have to explain, Tony, is can you explain to us the changes to access?
Thanks, Darren. Sure, Tony speaking. So new participants will be informed if they meet access to the NDIS by meeting the disability requirements, which is section 24, early intervention requirements, which is section 25, or both the disability and early intervention requirements. So in the future, participants will be supported by their appropriate participant pathway, depending on how they meet access. So there are no changes to how we make access decisions or build plans at the moment.
Excellent, thanks, Tony. So what will the changes to access mean for the participants?
Okay, sure. So in the future, participants will be supported to have a more tailored planning experience and funding outcomes. So depending on how they have accessed the NDIS. So the impact of this change will happen later once the new pathways are created. So it's going to take some time to create the new pathways, as we will work together with people with disability on how these can best be implemented to ensure the needs of participants and the agency are both met.
Thanks, Tony. And how do the changes impact early intervention?
So people who meet access to the NDIS under the early intervention requirements will be supported by the new early intervention pathway once that has been created.
Thanks, Tony. Look, some of this can be a bit confusing for people. So if we could just go back to the notice of impairments, can you just please explain that again for us?
Sure can. Okay, so all new participants to the NDIS receive an access decision letter, which says if access was met under the disability requirements, those early intervention requirements, or both. So from the 1st of January this year, new participants will also receive information about how they meet the disability or early intervention requirements. So this will include their category of impairment. So this change was introduced to the NDIS laws because the disability community advocated for participants to have more clarity and transparency about the basis of their access. So as Rodney mentioned, there are 6 impairment categories listed in the NDIS Act. So you can meet access to the scheme under one or more of these. So the categories are intellectual, cognitive, sensory, neurological, physical, and impairments relating to a psychosocial disability. So the categories and their definitions are outlined in our operational guidelines under the Applying to the NDIS, which is available on the NDIS website. So for children younger than 6 years old who meet the criteria for developmental delay, the information will say they are eligible under the early intervention requirements with developmental delay.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. Great explanation. Can you tell us why is the NDIS introducing notice of impairments?
Sure. So providing this information to participants, it gives clearer information about how they meet the disability or the early intervention requirements. So this responds to requests from participants and advocates to have more clarity and more transparency about the basis of their access to the NDIS. So this approach also recognises that people with disability who have the same diagnoses may have different impairments and different support needs. So this is consistent with the reforms recommended by the recent NDIS review.
Thanks again, Tony. Just to continue on with a few more questions that we find quite important. Can you tell us what does it mean for someone who is a new participant? So that would be an application submitted on or after the 1st of January 2025.
Sure, yeah. So all new participants receive an access decision letter, which says if access was met under the disability requirements, the early intervention requirements, or both. So from the 1st of January, new participants will also receive information about how they meet the disability or the early intervention requirements. So this will include their category or categories of impairment, and this change responds to requests from participants to have more clarity and more transparency about the basis of their access.
Okay, so what would that mean for someone who is an existing participant?
Sure. Okay, so there are no changes for existing participants. An existing participant, there is nothing you need to do right now. So we will work with existing participants to make sure they have the information they need ahead of any changes.
What will this mean for planning?
A good question. Yeah. So there are no changes to how we build plans or make decisions about reasonable and necessary funding for participants as a result of the impairment notices.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. Can we just go back to how someone could vary their notice of impairments?
Sure. So a participant can apply for a change to their notice of impairments. So this is called varying the notice of impairments. So it does not impact the participant's eligibility in the NDIS. So the participant may want to apply to add a category of impairments or to remove an existing category of impairments. So if a participant applies to vary the notice of impairment, we can support them to understand what evidence may now be required. So the NDIA will look at the participant's information to decide if we need to add or remove the categories of impairments in their notice. And then the participant will receive a letter advising if the NDIA has decided to vary their notice of impairments. So if the NDIA decides to vary the participant's notice of impairments, they will get a new notice of impairments. So this new notice will replace any previous notice of impairments that they have already received. So if a participant doesn't agree with the decision to vary or not to vary the notice of impairments, they can ask for a review of the decision.
Excellent. Great explanation. Thanks, Tony. Another part of that, what a lot of people were asking was, is every single participant going through the new planning framework going to receive a notice of impairment?
Okay, yeah, another good question. And the answer to this one is that we are still figuring this one out. So we're still working out the detail of reforms to the NDIS, including, and I'm going to introduce here what is known as the new planning framework. So the vision and intent of these reforms is to make sure that people have clearer information about how they have met eligibility, the eligibility requirements to the scheme, that they have a budget that is set by their real support needs, and they have flexibility in how they choose to spend that budget. So the notice of impairments is part of how we improve the way that we provide information to participants about their eligibility for NDIS funding to meet their disability support needs. So we want to ensure that all new and existing participants get this information and they get it at the right time. So we will be working with the disability community to design our approach to this transition.
Okay, so you've just introduced the phrase new planning framework. Can you tell us exactly what this is?
Sure. So the new planning framework guides how the NDIS will operate. So it explains how people can access the NDIS, how their needs are assessed, and how flexible budgets can be created. So because of changes to the legislation, plans will be built differently in the future. So this means that there will be two kinds of NDIS plans. So if your plan was developed through the current planning approach, this is going to be called an old framework plan. But if your plan is developed using the new assessment model, this will be a new framework plan. But the new planning framework hasn't started just yet.
Thanks, Tony. So how do the impairment categories work when a participant has more than one diagnosis or disability?
Sure. So the notice of impairment may have one or more impairment categories. So the decision about impairment categories is informed by evidence about different impairment types and by how the participant experiences their disability. So there are a few reasons why there may be multiple impairment categories. So a single diagnosis may impact a person in multiple ways or be associated with different kinds of impairments in different categories. So a participant may have an impairment associated with more than one diagnosis or condition. So the impairments may work together to meet the NDIS eligibility requirements. All the categories have equal weight and no category is more important than the other.
Thanks, Tony. Another question around that was, so why does the notice refer to impairments and not a diagnosis?
Sure. So the NDIS is not a scheme based on diagnoses, but based on functional impact of a person's impairments. So rather than focusing on the diagnosis a person may have when they access the scheme, we try and understand how their impairment impacts on their function. So individuals with the same diagnosis may have different associated impairments, levels of functioning, and then different support needs. So, for example, when a participant is eligible for the NDIS because they meet the disability requirements, so this means that they have a permanent impairment that has a substantial impact on their ability to do daily life activities. So they may also have other impairments which don't meet the NDIS criteria, and we can connect them to other services for future supports if needed. So if a participant is unsure about what an impairment category is that's listed on their notice, or they are concerned that an impairment has not been considered, we encourage them to contact us so that we can discuss this further.
Thanks, Tony. Well explained. If I could just ask now, why is the language different for psychosocial disability than other impairment types? For example, impairments relating to psychosocial disability.
Okay, sure. So psychosocial disability impairments can result in the participant having a reduced capacity to do daily life activities and tasks due to their mental health. So participants with psychosocial challenges may struggle to take part in education, training, work, or other community-based activities. So mental health issues like bipolar and schizophrenia are often linked to these challenges, but other conditions such as autism can also lead to psychosocial difficulties.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. So can I now ask, how will impairment notices relate to the new support needs assessment? Once someone gets a support needs assessment, can the NDIA impairment change if the evidence changes?
Yeah, that's another great question and one that I do appreciate. However, at this moment, we don't have a definitive answer, but please know that we are actively working on it. So the new NDIS Act introduces the legislative framework for new framework plans, whereby a support needs assessment will form the basis of determining a participant's reasonable and necessary budget in the future. So there is considerable work which is required to design the support needs assessment and budget model, including identification of suitable needs assessment tools or tools, the co-design and consultation with people with disability, workforce planning, and the development of the rules to describe the method by which a support needs assessment will be translated to a participant budget. So in February this year, the NDIA released an approach to market for support needs assessment tools to start to support this process. So participants will still be able to apply to vary their notice of impairment if their evidence changes.
Thanks, Tony. Just being conscious of time, can I just quickly ask, what is a support needs assessment?
Sure. So the NDIS review recommended a different approach to planning to deliver better and fairer outcomes for NDIS participants. So this included the development of a new way to gather information about the support people need to inform their NDIS budget, called a support needs assessment. So a support needs assessment is a process that will be used to better understand a participant's support needs in the future and to develop their budget. So it's going to include strength-based assessment that will focus on a participant's support needs rather than functional capacity. So support needs assessments are a key step in the NDIS reform process to help to move toward a better way of planning. So the NDIA understands the new ways of gathering information will change participants' experience, and we will continue to talk and to listen to the disability community every step of this journey.
Thanks, Tony. Look, a few more questions for the people that are still with us. Can you tell us about what's happening now? Can you share with us what's changing now?
Sure, I can. Yeah. So for most participants, they will continue to have their plans developed using that current process for some time still to come. So it will take 5 years for all participants to have their NDIS budgets developed in this new way. So we are taking 5 years to make sure the transition isn't rushed, and we continue to learn and improve as we go. So we will continue to talk with and to listen to people with disability, their families, carers, and representatives as we progress through this year of the design and the testing, and as we transition to the new way of working in the future. So we will also keep letting everyone know where we were up to in the design and testing so that the same information is available to everyone.
Thanks, Tony. And what's going to happen next? If we just look at looking from, say, now through to April this year.
Sure. So the first step is to work with people with disability to understand the best way to collect information about people's support needs and then how to use this to build an NDIS budget. So people with disability will be involved in choosing the best way to collect information. So we already know that people want us to make this as simple and as easy as possible for people so that they don't need to keep sharing personal information or retelling their story. So the second step is to agree how the NDIA will collect information and how to talk with participants about their NDIS budgets and how they can use their budgets. So this includes agreeing how participants can provide information. So we know that there will be many areas that we will need to work through with participants to make sure the system is fair and equitable for people who are in all different circumstances. So we are working with people with disability and disability representatives to design this, and we have a proposed approach to share this around April this year.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. So do you know what happens post-April?
Yeah, so from April until September, that's when the third step will come into play, and that is to test the new approach to gathering information and setting a person's NDIS budget to make sure that it actually works well before we start using it. So we will include testing the new way of working with participants without affecting their plans or current budgets. So we will keep listening and making these improvements to the process and also to reflect on the feedback that we receive along the way. So then from September, we will gradually start working with participants to develop their NDIS budgets using the new approach. And we will do this gradually so that we can keep testing and keep improving the way we work. In this early stage, we will also build in additional checks to make sure this approach is working well and that participants' NDIS budgets are fair and consistent. So we will start gradually to make sure the new approach works well for participants, and we will continue that learning and improving on how to do this, so that we can then make the transition a smooth process for participants. We all know that these changes do create anxiety for people, and we want to make the process as clear and as simple as a process as we can for people.
Great. Thanks for those responses, Tony. We appreciate all the information that you have shared. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you to those people who have stayed on, and I do apologise for taking up some of your time. Thank you to Olivia and Emma for responding so diligently within the chat. Hopefully you all got some useful knowledge and some great information out of all of this. And I thank you again for your time. Thanks, everyone.